All right, so now we move on to the phases of the adjustment. So far in this program, we've looked at the history of NUCA, we looked at the X-ray analysis and the biomechanics, we looked at headpiece placement and where on the head you would support your patient. And so now the next one is the phases of the adjustment. So this is the actual adjustment, how it's delivered in order. So in general, in NUCA, the adjustment involves much more than the contact point. The doctor's feet must be aligned to the horizontal resultant. The doctor's spine must be perpendicular to the horizontal resultant. The doctor's pelvis and shoulder must be parallel and aligned to the correct angle. The doctor's episternal notch must be over the saddleback point. The doctor's hands and arms must be aligned to the contact point, and the doctor's neck must be in a locked position. What we do is it's called the neck lock. So here are the 8 phases. We have an approach phase, and each one of these breaks down into individual steps. The saddleback phase, the turn-in phase, the arch phase, the roll-in phase, the conversion phase. I have in parentheses the pelvic lever phase because that's not necessarily done every time, only in the larger misalignment factors or longer horizontal resultants. And then the triceps pull phase, which is the actual adjustment. So the first step of the, well, okay, so let me just say this. I did this photographs for this a while ago, so I refer to this as my hair days. So the first step of the approach phase is the neck lock. And this is not a flexion of the neck so much as a straightening of the cervical spine. So the chin is brought into the neck slightly. This serves the purpose of straightening the C-spine and bringing the chin into the neck slightly. This protects the spine and facilitates the triceps action. So in the approach phase then, the second step is to align, the doctor must align his or her pelvis and shoulders to the horizontal resultant. And so in this slide, you can see that this yellow line here represents the horizontal resultant, and the doctor has to stand so that his or her pelvis is parallel, like the acetabula and glenoid fossas is parallel to this line. So then so let's say if this is a left listing, so the doctor stands in such a way that the right foot is placed closer to the patient and is actually pointed outward a little bit, and then what's called the plantar reflex is initiated by dragging the toes to the point where a long axis through the foot, in this case the right foot with a left hand contact, is perpendicular to the horizontal resultant. This ensures the correct alignment of the doctor's body in subsequent steps. For example, when you're walking, if your foot is flared, it's harder to walk in a straight line. So this helps the doctor ensure that subsequent steps keep his or her body aligned to the horizontal resultant. The outside leg, or the left foot in this case with the left listing, which is further from the patient, is turned, is brought forward. Now the lateral foot spread is always mimics the width of the acetabula. So it's not an A-frame stance for the legs, nor is it so small that the base of support is easier to lose, or center of gravity shifts outside. So, and then the A to P foot spread is determined by, first of all, the doctor's flexibility, and second of all, and more importantly, by the size of the horizontal resultant, the length. Because the larger the horizontal resultant, the longer the A to P foot spread has to become in order to have the pelvis rotate in the frontal plane more to attain those angles. So once the foot is brought forward and the center of gravity or most of the weight of the doctor's stance should be on the ball of the forward foot. And then there's a turning in of the toes slightly to pigeon toe, and what that does is it bridges the base of support in this case. So there's a really characteristic look to this when it's done correctly, because the feet are planted and the weight is on the toes. If the weight shifts to the heels, then you could see that the toes will lift because the center of gravity is too far back. So the next step in the approach phase is, as the forward foot is advanced, in this case the left leg, the doctor has to bend at the acetabulum in order to maintain the center of gravity and the weight over the forward foot. And so here you can see that the lumbar curve is intact. The spine is in its normal orientation as when standing, and all of the motion has occurred at the acetabulum. You can see that the neck lock is intact and that the spine has its normal orientation. So the hands are placed here out of sync, but I just wanted to demonstrate what that looks like. So the doctor, this is the settle back phase now. So after finishing the approach phase, the settle back phase is an action where both of the acetabula are pushed backward down an inclined plane. And as the acetabula move down that inclined plane, because of the disparity of the foot spread, the left side of the pelvis will tip in the frontal plane much more than the right side. And so that then introduces angulation. And of course, the shoulders should mimic that. And what's important here is that you can see in this case at the end of the settle back, the spine is pretty much horizontal. And it should be between horizontal and just a few degrees higher at the head. And in this case, the episternal notch, when you're done, if you drop a vertical line in there, should be directly at the saddleback point. And we practice with either wearing a tie or a plumb bob that is attached to the shirt. So the saddleback also, important point here, it brings the doctor closer to the patient. So you can see that when I'm in this position, my scapulas are still retracted, or actually adducted, and you can see that the distance here is about right for making contact with the patient's neck. So in the saddleback, the spinal lever should be in a straight line. In other words, so there's no flexing of the lumbar spine. There's also no rounding of the thoracic spine as the doctor bends at the acetabulum. So the spine is maintained in a straight line, nor is there any lateral movement at all in this maneuver. And you can see, as this doctor is demonstrating, that her base of support is correctly done. She's bridged her forward foot a little bit, and you can see that the toes are planted, and there's good control of the doctor's weight in this. So looking at it from a different perspective, you can see I've drawn lines across the PSISs and across like points on the scapulas, and you can see that those lines are parallel. And so that the spinal lever is coming this way, which is perpendicular to these lines, and that parallelness between the pelvis and the shoulder girdle must be maintained. Each listing has its own angle requirements. And actually, I have to add, the doctor has to also do the calculations for his or her notch transverse resultant, which can be different among doctors, because that too will have an impact on what angle is needed for a given listing. So after those steps are done, the doctor must then initiate the turn-in. So the doctor moves to place his or her episternal notch directly over the transverse process of C1. This is done by centering the motion around the ankles so that it isn't bending the C-spine, but rather it's turning from the ankles, so the entire upper body moves as a unit to bring then the episternal notch closer to where the contact is. It should be actually directly over the contact in this case. And the reason we do that is because that way when you make contact, the arm is in a proper position and the scapula remains in its abducted position, and the humeral ball is in its proper location relative to the glenoid fossa. Otherwise, if the doctor is further away or hasn't settled back completely, the tendency is to reach, and that disturbs the relationship of the arms and scapula. So the next phase is the arch phase. So to do the arch phase, it's done by taking a radial deviation of both hands. In this case, this is the left hand, and you can see that this is flat through the wrist, and all the wrinkling of the skin is on the radial side of the forearm. You could see that the fingers are abducted from midline, and then the pinky and thumb are maximally extended, and actually, it's as if they were trying to look at each other over the back of the hand. And the reason for that is that the sesamoid bone, pisiform, which is a sesamoid bone, is loose if the palmar fascia is relaxed, but this radial deviation with the fingers spread and the thumb and little finger extended, this then really tightens the palmar fascia, and the pisiform becomes a solid portion with which to adjust on that transverse process. The next phase is the roll-in phase. So the roll-in hand, in this case the right hand, is also in radial deviation. You can see the wrinkles on the radial aspect of the forearm. The second hand is placed proximal to the snuff box with the pisiform at 90 degrees. So it's 90 degrees this way. And then both hands are still radially deviated and the palmar fascia is tensioned. The next step in the roll-in phase is to rotate the shoulder of roll-in hand, hooking the thumb underneath the radial bone on the contact hand. And the key here is to use not the forearm, as in you would supinate or pronate, but rather the shoulder, which rotates the entire arm. And the key there is that that maintains the tight position of the roll-in hand pisiform in the contact hand snuff box. And so this step really helps ensure that that's in there. The next phase then is to wrist break. That's another step. So in the wrist break, the doctor reverses the shoulder rotation from the previous step, and then keeping the thumb locked, you can see how firmly that's held in there. The roll-in hand is partially supinated. So if we go back to the prior slide, pay attention to the area in here and the general orientation of the arm. So you go from this position to this. And you can see how I've stretched the thumb and the area in the webbing. And yet this also serves to drive the pisiform further into the snuff box of contact hand. So once that's done, then the doctor deviates only the fingers. In other words, not the whole hand, but only from the knuckles distally. The fingers are radiated to the ulnar side, and the fingers are wrapped around the wrist. So you can see that this is still stretched. You can still see that there's no wrinkling due to dorsiflexion of the wrist. And the goal here is to maintain, of course, contact of pisiform in snuff box, keep the thumb tension going, and the fifth finger, the pinky of roll-in hand, should actually wrap around distal to the styloid process of contact hand. And then, of course, the shoulders are equalized.